Flow just won the 2025 Oscar for the Best Animated Feature Film, which left everyone wondering how. What did it get right, both in production and narrative, that made it so impactful with such a small budget? Well, ultimately, it boils down to one thing: authenticity. It just feels real. You're able to empathize with the characters. And there are a ton of little techniques that Flow used to achieve this, but they all fall under 3 broad categories. So by the end of this video, you'll understand what Flow did right, and learn how to apply these techniques to tell better stories with your own renders. So what specific techniques did Flow use? Well, the 3 broad categories are naturalism, personified cinematography, and visual storytelling. Let's start with naturalism. This is the most basic of the 3 techniques, and there's a good chance you're using some aspects of it in your own renders, but it's largely been forgotten by major studios. If you're not familiar with naturalism, it's quite similar to realism. It's essentially representing the world in its true form. And you may hear that and say, Flow isn't naturalistic, it's stylized. And you would be right, because we aren't talking about photorealism, but rather naturalistic storytelling, and it manifests itself in 4 distinct ways. The first is the most conspicuous. It's naturalistic characters. And while this is really obvious, there are 2 reasons why it's crucial. Firstly, it sets Flow apart. In a world where every movie is full of anthropomorphized characters that are no different than people, Flow is unique. The animals can't talk. They have to overcome challenges in their own way, which creates a compelling story. Secondly, they fall into pre-existing schemas, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying we already have a connection with dogs and cats. We understand what drives them. So when we see a naturalistic representation of them like we have in Flow, it becomes much easier to form a connection with the characters because we've already fallen in love with the species. But when animals are basically people, for example in Zootopia, they don't fall into pre-existing schemas. The movie has to show us why we should care, rather than just building on our pre-existing love for animals. Throughout the movie, Flow obviously builds a stronger connection between the individual animals and the audience. But because it's using naturalism, it gets a head start, which is especially impactful for a film with no dialogue. And this is a powerful technique that you can use in your own renders to create a bond between the characters and the audience, especially when you don't have an hour and a half to tell a compelling story. The second and third usages of naturalism go hand in hand: pacing and scale. A lot of films rely on fast pacing and grand spectacle to retain interest. This strategy is used everywhere, from YouTube to Hollywood. It's called the age of excess, and it works because it makes up for poor writing with grandiosity. But Flow is different. There's no antagonist or final battle, but rather the story is driven forward by naturalism. The pacing is slow. The scale is small. Most of the story takes place on this small boat, and it shows the struggle of the cat to survive in this new world and connect with other animals, which makes it feel authentic and refreshing. Finally, the last use of naturalism is through sound design. Every animal is voiced by its real-world counterpart, except for apparently the capybara, because they don't make that much noise, so instead it was voiced by a baby camel. This genuine voice acting further adds to the authenticity of the film. My dog normally ignores all TV, but whenever the cat or lemur would make any sound, she would look up and act all interested, probably because they're so squeaky and high-pitched that they sound exactly like she does. The music isn't overbearing. The Foley is on point. Every piece of sound design adds to the authenticity and immersion of the film, which is exactly what you get when naturalism is your foundation. However, integrating naturalism or any of these other techniques may require you to learn new tools. But that's where today's sponsor, Brilliant, comes in. Have you ever tried to learn a new skill? Well, I have, and it's really hard. You have to force yourself to be disciplined and get better. And most of the time, at least for me, it ends in failure. But Brilliant makes the learning process easy. They provide you with simple, digestible lessons that you can complete every day. We all know gamification is a powerful learning technique, and Brilliant uses it to its fullest. It helps you get smarter every day with thousands of interactive lessons in math, science, programming, data analysis, and AI. And because Brilliant makes it easier to be consistent, you learn much more effectively. I personally have been learning Python, which has been much easier with Brilliant because they give you simple, interactive lessons to complete every single day so you don't get overwhelmed. It's a perfect way to pass the time instead of mindless scrolling because you can learn anywhere, right on your phone. If you use my link in the description, you'll get a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual subscription. But now let's get back to the video. The second technique that Flow uses is personified cinematography, which is basically just treating your camera like a character. This is something that live action movies do all the time, but it's often forgotten in animation.
And I think why La La Land was such an extraordinary thing is because it took the approach of realizing the camera was another character in the scene. And that's actually how Damien introduced me. Like when I met Em and Ryan, he was like, this is Ari, he's gonna be the other actor in these scenes.
When done right, this leads to a much more immersive and authentic story. So how does Flow do this? Well, it does it in 3 different ways. First, it's in its shot length. The average shot duration in Flow is 15.8 seconds, divided across 307 shots. This is opposed to the 4.5 second average shot duration of the Wild Robot. This long take shooting style is in line with the slow naturalism we already talked about, but it also allows the viewer to feel like they're there with the characters.
Having these long takes creates that sense of real time, that you're experiencing the story with the characters.
This isn't quite to the extreme of something like 1917, that was one shot for the entire movie. But the shooting style treats the audience like another character, as they experience the narrative in real time. The second technique is pretty simple, so we won't spend too long on it. It's the use of perspective. Due to the shooting style of Flow, the camera moves a lot. Since the average shot duration is so long, you don't want the camera to just be stationary. That would be really boring. So instead, the camera is dynamic. At some points, it puts you on the level of the characters, allowing you to experience the world from their perspective. While at other points, it focuses on the environment, showing how vast the world is and how insignificant their little boat is in comparison. The masterful shot selection of Flow is something that you can add to your own renders very easily, and you'll see a huge difference. The final cinematography tactic used in Flow is documentary realism. One of the reasons a show like The Office feels authentic is because the camera isn't always in the right place. Sometimes they're shooting through blinds, or they miss the first couple seconds of a moment because they're whipping over to capture it. And this makes the moment feel genuine. Now, Flow, of course, is not shot in the same way as The Office, but sometimes the shots aren't perfect. The animals move out of frame, just like what would happen if this were shot by a real camera crew. Notably, this is very subtle. They don't overdo it, but it subconsciously plants in our brain that these are real characters. They aren't just actors for the camera, even though every aspect of their movement is well thought out by the animator. This was clearly stated in the Flow Animation Style Guide, which says, "We add a documentary aspect to the choreography of the characters by letting animals go out of the screen or get cut off by the screen edge. Let the spectators think that the characters are free and spontaneous and the camera can't predict their movements." Finally, the last category is the one you'll be able to use in your own work most, and that's visual storytelling. Most of us aren't going to make a feature film or even a short film, but these techniques can be used in your own renders and even stills. Flow is the perfect example of how to use visual storytelling because that's all they have. They can't rely on exposition to make up for bad writing. Instead, they use 2 techniques to visually tell the story. First is animation. Now, we already talked about naturalism in the animation. So how does Flow convey the emotions of the characters while maintaining naturalism and without any dialogue? Well, that's a difficult task. Flow actually has their own website that was used. It's essentially like a rule book or style guide for the animation team, and this is what it says about conveying emotion through the animation. Each animal has its own behavior. So when you animate the shot in a naturalistic way, keep in mind how the character reacts and lives. You have to show its personality. Sometimes, depending on what is happening in the shot, you have to take some liberties. Once you give it some thought, this approach feels painfully obvious. Of course, animals convey emotions. You don't have to give them human expressions to convey that. But most movies do, which is one reason why Flow feels different. If you go to the animation style guide site, you'll see like 300 videos and image references of each of the different animals, showing them when they're swimming in water, when they're running, when they're angry, curious, sad, everything. And even though everyone already knows the importance of thorough reference, we often neglect it. The second aspect of visual storytelling is color. I'll leave a link in the description to the best tutorial I've ever found on what emotion colors convey and different color harmonies, but you don't have to be an expert colorist to understand what they mean. Throughout the majority of the film, it's filled with warm colors, bright green, blue, and yellow, which convey warmth, tranquility, and peace. And at the beginning of the film, the water is a dark, menacing blue. But as the cat becomes more comfortable with the water, it turns into an inviting aqua. These sorts of color transitions can be seen everywhere once you're looking for them, but the most notable instance is in the climax, when the entire color palette shifts to dark grays, black, brown. This helps to put you in the emotional state of the characters as they're experiencing this tension, uncertainty, and darkness. This is one of the most powerful filmmaking techniques, especially in animation, because you have full creative control.